the reliability of the Bible compare with the reliability of the Quran? Many Muslims say it's been perfectly preserved. Do they have these unnecessary details and the other things you were mentioning in your talk? If you can speak on that. Thank you.
Great question. For the sake of time, no. That's the short answer, right? I think what we see the Quran is very different in that, like I said, the Bible is 66 books written over a period of 1,600 years on 3 different continents by close to 40 different authors. The Quran is one book written in one time, 7th century, in one place, Arabia, in one language, Hijizi script Arabic. And so, in one sense, it's not really fair to compare the Quran and the Bible because we're comparing apples to orchards. There's just so much more going on with the Bible. But when we look at what the Quran, which comes 600 years after Jesus, communicates, what we see is that it's claiming to communicate facts about very similar people and situations that the Bible is, and yet makes a lot of errors and mistakes that scream lack of verisimilitude and credibility. It mixes up people and places in a way that just should be red flags for us. And ultimately, in chapter 4, verse 157, denies one of the most easily verifiable events of ancient history, which is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It says that they neither, talking about the Jews, they neither crucified him, nor did he die, but it was made to appear to them. And it has the Jews boasting, we killed Jesus, the Messiah, the son of Mary, which is a very strange thing to say. If the Jews believed that and thought he was the Messiah, they wouldn't have killed him. So it starts off with an error, and then it goes on to completely deny that this event ever happened. And that is a problem for the Quran, and one that has many Muslims that I sympathize painted into a corner and trying to defend it. Because even the most skeptical of scholars, individuals who say, despite all of the stuff we've talked about, we can't really have much reliability in the source information about who Jesus was, but we can know that he was crucified and died under the Roman governorship of Pontius Pilate. We can know that because of both what the Bible teaches and from sources outside of the Bible. And so the Quran denies that simple fact, and in doing so, denies the reality of an event that we have an incredible level of confidence to say that this event actually happened. And then, on top of that, the Quran, time and time again, talks about the previous scriptures that the Jews had, the Torah and the Gospel. And it says that these were documents that were given in the same nature as the revelation of the Quran. They were given with guidance and light. They were, the Arabic word is natsal, sent down in the same way. That Moses was given the Torah and it was full of guidance and light, and Jesus was given the gospel and it was full of guidance and light. And then, in chapter 6 of the Quran, it says, and let the people of the gospel judge by what they have therein, and if they do not judge by what Allah has revealed to them, then they are the defiantly disobedient. So it prefaces it by saying, God sent the Torah to Moses, he sent the gospel to Jesus, and the people of the gospel, Christians, Dan and I, need to judge by what Allah has given, what God has given to us as Christians, that being the gospel. And if we don't judge by using the gospel, then we are the defiantly disobedient. Here's the problem. When I do that, when I obey that, when I judge using the gospel, and I use that as the lens by which I look into the Quran, I find the Quran has no understanding of the communication of what the gospel facts are, historically or theologically. It denies its central precepts. And so if the Quran is true and it tells me as a Christian to judge by the gospel, then the Quran is false. And if the Quran is false, then the Quran is false. So the Quran has a dilemma, because this is not just in one place. This is in multiple places throughout the Quran. Because I do not think the author of the Quran had any earthly idea what the Torah or the Gospel were, and assumed that he knew. And that's where we get stories from people, individuals named in our Bible, like Abraham, like Moses, and even like Mary and Jesus and John the Baptist, but are drawing on sources not historically reliable that we know go back to the source material, but are often oral stories floating around 7th century Arabia, mostly folk tales and apocryphal campfire stories from this time period of Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, assuming those are what the gospel and the Torah are, and then making these profound mistakes. And then communicates in an effort to get the Jews and the Christians on board by saying, I know what you have, it's a revelation, and what it says is like the revelation that I'm giving to you, so judge by what you have, and judge it by what I'm giving you. And it's not until later, when this book was translated into Arabic in its entirety, that Muslims started to go, uh-oh, we have a problem. And that's where arguments about corruption come into view. And so the first part of the question, is the Quran perfectly preserved? The answer is no. We have textual variants all throughout the manuscript tradition of the Quran in particular manuscripts. There are far fewer manuscripts, and what that does is, in testifying to what I talked about tonight, the fewer manuscripts you have, the more you have to rely that those people get it right. The more manuscripts you have, the more you have the ability to compare and contrast and trace back the original text and have confidence in that. So there are layers of the non-reliability internally and externally to the Quran that communicate that by the same standard, this is true and that's wrong.
Talk to. From a historian perspective, how accurate do you think the Quran is, for example?
Well, I think the Quran has a number of problematic historical issues, the chief of which is that Surah 4:157 denies the historical crucifixion of Jesus. And so there's ambiguity as to what's going on in that text when it says that Jesus was neither killed nor was he crucified. And I think that really paints the historical reliability of the Quran into a corner, in that, like I said before, Pierce, if there's one thing that even the most skeptical scholars historically will say, if they say we really can know not that much about Jesus of Nazareth, they will admit and say what we can know is that he did die under the reign of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea at that time, that he was indeed crucified. The Quran seems to talk about what I believe, talks about the Torah and the gospel multiple times, and seems to fundamentally not understand what the Torah and the gospel are. Particularly, I would highlight verses like chapter 5, verse 46 and 47, which has this chain of custody where it says that that God sent following in the footsteps Jesus, the son of Mary, to confirm the Torah which came before him, and that he gave the gospel, which in the Quran uses the same terminology for the revelation of the Quran, that it has guidance and light, and that the gospel preceded the Torah. And verse 47 of chapter 5 of the Quran actually addresses me as a Christian. It says, let the people of the gospel judge by what God has revealed therein, being the gospel, and whoever does not judge by what God has revealed. So I find a problem with the Quran in that it confirms the Torah and the gospel, and it tells me as a Christian in chapter 5, verse 46 and 47, to judge by the gospel. However, Pierce, when I judge the Quran by the gospel, I find that the Quran does not understand what the gospel is or says. And ultimately, I would say, if the Quran is true, and I need to take it seriously to not be one of the defiantly disobedient, as it says, and I judge the gospel, by using the gospel, I judge the Quran, I find that the Quran is hugely problematic historically, but also in that it simply does not understand either what the Torah or the gospel are, or what
the
Christians
Quran.
actually believe.
After you read the book the first time, what was your impression? Did you say, oh, wow, complete different understanding than what I thought was going to be in the book of Quran? This is actually a great book. I actually enjoyed this. I actually learned this. What was your impression at the end?
I mean, have you ever read the Quran?
I've never read the book.
Okay, so the Quran is interesting in that when you come to it, especially if you're a Christian and you're expecting things to be chronological, and when you open up a Bible, Genesis...
Structured.
Right. Genesis says, in the beginning, and that's in the beginning, and by the time you get to the end, Revelation is the end, right? The Quran is structured differently in that the biggest chapters are at the beginning and the smallest chapters are at the end. So there's 114 surahs or chapters in the Quran, and the way that it's been put together and structured is very, very different than something like the Bible, in that it's not in a narrative theme or a chronological theme, but it's on the basis of the chapters. And there are various reasons for that in terms of the overall way that the Quran eventually got codified. Because during Muhammad's lifetime, the Quran was oral. And actually, there was a hesitancy after Muhammad died in 632, I believe it was, Muhammad dies. I could be wrong on the date. I'm just going off the top of my head.
632 AD on June 8th, apparently, for those who are interested.
Muhammad dies, and actually the Muslims who are following him have a hesitancy to write it down because Muhammad never told them to write it down. But there's this process that eventually gets put into place because Muhammad's successors in the caliphs realize that people have memorized the Quran differently. And so
What does that mean? Memorize the Quran differently?
Yeah. So you had these individuals who were following Muhammad around and they were memorizing everything he was saying. And so part of this process is that we're remembering things slightly differently. And I believe it was so Abu Bakr, I think, is the second rightly guided caliph in the succession after Muhammad. He's the person who starts the process of kind of bringing together all of these recitations of the Quran. And then that's finalized under a later caliph by the name of Uthman. And Uthman, I think when they come to Abu Bakr, the statement literally that they say is, save us before we differ like the Christians and the Jews before us. And that they saw that there were some things that the Christians and the Jews were disagreeing on between their written texts, and they didn't want that to happen with the Quran. And so there's a period of time under Uthman where it's called the Uthmanic revision, where he gathers all of these documents together, all of these different recitations, and he codifies it into one document and he destroys all of the differing ones. So in that sense, you do have a standardized version, but it's in terms of like the history of how texts are produced and disseminated, it's what's called a controlled transmission. It's essentially a government oversight of it, right? So the great thing about having only one version is that you don't have any disagreements, but if you only have one version, you have to trust that the guy who compiled that one version got it right. And there were actually companions of Muhammad within the oral or within the traditional sources of Islamic literature called the Hadith that talk about the fact that there were particular individuals who were very close to Muhammad during his lifetime who did not want to give their Quran kind of versions to Uthman because they knew that theirs was going to differ with Uthman's and he would probably destroy it. These are not, controversial in the sense that these are part of the traditional Islamic sources in the Hadith. But I think within the history of how the Quran gets put together, you see something very different than what you see in the Bible. And so when you're reading it, especially if what I did, open up the front and then read all the way through, there are parts of the Quran that are confusing because they don't necessarily follow what would be considered a overly rational order in terms of the flow of the text. So I open it up, I read it. Some things sound familiar in some ways, and that it's talking about Moses and Noah and even, Jesus, Mary are in there. But there are components of it that they're so far from what the biblical narrative is that it just seems off. And I think there's a very
often in a sense that it's not chronological.
Yeah.
Where it's not in order. Is that what you mean? That's off, or
well, the stories are very different a lot of the time. So,
okay.
What I think we can derive from the historical record is basically that if you take the traditional Islamic narrative, Muhammad was illiterate. So he's not said to have been a learned individual. And so he is, if we take the traditional narrative once again, he's a caravaner in 7th century Arabia. And so he is going around Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula. He's going up into countries like what are today modern day Jordan.
What is this, Rob? Is this chatgpt you pulled up, or
no? This was just Google.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah. So if we go by that traditional narrative, he's a caravaner. He's going around. He's being exposed to Christians and Jews because they're all over the place in Syria and in Jordan and in Iraq. These were Christian countries a lot of the time. And he's hearing these stories about who the Christians and the Jews believe are their prophets and individuals within that are part of the religion. But he's not able to discern between the difference between an actual historical source like, say, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and, say, apocryphal Christian tales that are floating around the Arabian Peninsula. And so because there is this inability to actually discern between those sources, some of those things get incorporated into the Quran. So, and we can trace this. A friend of mine, Andy Bannister, did his PhD dissertation, and then he published a book on this. It's called The Oral Formulaic Construction of the Quran, where we can actually tie certain stories in the Quran to apocryphal sources that were floating around in the subsequent centuries after Jesus. So there's a document called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas, which is very different. But the Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas has a story where Jesus, the childhood Jesus, is making clay birds beside a riverbank. And the Jewish officials get mad at him because he's doing this on the Sabbath. He's breaking the Sabbath. They go off to get his parents to get him into trouble. And Jesus breathes on the birds. They turn into real birds and they fly away. So this is an apocryphal story. It comes centuries after the actual historical Jesus. It has no historical ties to the historical Jesus, but it's a popular story that's being incorporated into this infancy narrative.
In the Quran.
So the Quran adopts it. So we can trace it to the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and then later Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Quran borrows it and incorporates it, but we know that it's not an actual historical story of Jesus. So when I say that there were stories that like they're familiar.
So what's your point with that? What's your point with that?
That there are stories that are familiar in that you're seeing the name Jesus. You're seeing the name John the Baptist. You're seeing the name Mary. But when you're reading these stories about them in the Quran, they're not stories that they're not echoing biblical stories as much as they're talking about these characters in very different ways that if you don't know about, say, you know, where these sources are coming from, if you're not looking into the infancy narratives, then you're like, well, what is this? Like, this is confusing. Is this more information? Is this right information? And so now later in life, in my formal education, digging into some of those things and figuring out, okay, well, here's how we trace those sources. Here's the paper trail. Here's how we can connect those dots between where potentially the author of the Quran was actually getting them from. That's when I did a lot of that legwork. But originally I was reading the Quran and I found it unusual, but I also found it did not accurately reflect things that I was looking for to answer the ultimate questions.